Good morning in Washington. Good afternoon in Kyiv and other European capitals. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have an excellent event for you this morning regarding Moscow's aggression in Ukraine and the diplomacy surrounding it. Our speakers today include Deborah Kagan, the Senior Advisor at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, Lieutenant General retired Doug Lute, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, former Deputy at the National Security Council and a Board Director of the Atlantic Council. We have Ambassador Steve Pfeiffer, a former U.S. Ambassador to Kyiv, to Ukraine, and the William J. Perry Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. And we have Hannah Shelest, the Director of Security Programs, Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism, Editor-in-Chief, Ukraine Analytica. So with that, I will jump straight into the questions. And we'll start with General Lute. Doug, what is the current state of the war? How is Moscow's offensive in Bakhmut going? And will there be a larger Russian offensive?
Well, thanks to the Atlantic Council and John for bringing us together this morning. Look, I think tactically, the war has settled into essentially a stalemate. And it's been that way for some months now, essentially since the significant Ukrainian advance around Kherson some months ago. And the ground changes hands back and forth, but these are moves of kilometers or a mile or so, not moves that are significantly or operationally important in the major fight. One thing that continues is attrition on both sides. So heavy losses, both by on the hands of both the Ukrainians and the Russian forces. And that points a bit to the bigger trend, which is that this has become a war of durability, of staying power. And that points beyond the tactical fight to the strategic part of this contest. And here, I think Putin's bet is that he can outlast Ukraine and the West. And he's counting on divisions or a lack of cohesion with regard to Western support to Ukraine. So far, the West is holding together quite well and quite admirably. Give the U.S. High marks in terms of leadership, NATO high marks in terms of being the sort of organizing platform for that military support to Ukraine. But Putin's betting that over time, that support will lapse. And it's really up to us, I think, to prove him wrong.
Okay, thank you. Hannah, there has been some controversy in Ukraine and abroad regarding Ukraine's stout defense of Bakhmut. Some say it has been a smart way to severely weaken the Russian military. Others that Ukraine should conserve its assets for a counteroffensive. Your view and your overall assessment of the battlefield.
Thank you, John, for the question. Definitely, everybody been expecting the same type of the counteroffensive that we saw in Izium or in Kherson. So something big, significant, looking nice, many kilometers of the liberated territories. But we cannot expect the war be only like this. And there were a lot of stuff happening around, especially in the eastern Ukraine, if you speak about there. But also, you need to look into the detail. The Bakhmut became a symbol. It's not that Bakhmut is tremendously important from the strategic point of view. Definitely, operationally, that is the entrance to some of the other towns, but that is a small town. It's not something significant, and Russians are trying to capture it since July. So this also demonstrates their capabilities and their capacities of any type of the serious counteroffensive. At the same time, what General said, that definitely over there, it is now more of the war of attrition because the situation is changing daily. A week ago, we heard that Ukrainians are almost encircled and probably they will withdraw from there. Just yesterday, we heard that no, Ukrainians are not encircled, Russians cannot go further, and we are even counteroffensiving in some of the parts of the cities. So the situation there is changing, but nobody is really winning or moving where it is necessary. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that the situation on the ground is not changing. Ukraine is trying to drain not only Russian personnel and the ammunition around Bakhmut, but also to target the important logistics and important storage of ammunition. Like yesterday, for example, the explosion happened in Jankoy in Crimea. First of all, we knew that it was the storage of caliber missiles, what Russians are lacking as per now, and each of them is very important for them. And the second, it was a very important railway node for Crimea. So sometimes our counter-offensive operations, I cannot say campaign, but some actions, operations, are happening not exactly where you're expecting it, somewhere in the Donetsk region. We're also expecting that something can come very soon around Berdyansk or around Zaporizhia, because we see the concentration of forces from two sides over there. That's why Bakhmut is important, first of all, for the Russian Federation. They need to demonstrate at least some victory, some symbolic victory about which they talked that much. Plus, it is important because of the conflict between Prigozhin and the Wagner Group and Ministry of Defense, because Prigozhin promised to the president that he can take it. He is capable. Ministry of Defense is not capable. And now it became a prize of dignity for him. Will he be able to do it or not? And at the same time, for Ukraine, it doesn't matter. It is Bakhmut, Ugledar, Konstantinovka, or any other village. That's Ukrainian territory. That's why you will see the attempts to take it. My small comment for the phrase that Putin can outlast Ukraine. It seems to me that we should be very careful in terms of both underestimated and overestimated Russian capacities. Definitely, Russia is interested in the stalemate and the certain freezing of the situation because they will have time for, at least to train the newly mobilized people for them to be more effective. But at the same time, in terms of ammunition, time is not on his side, because time will allow Ukraine to deliver all those military equipment and ammunition that's already been promised and that is already on the way. European Union just made a decision about greater production. And for Putin, we see that he is crazily in search of the ammunition all around the world. That's why his conversations with China, that's why he's pushing Iran, and that's why we know that he's in search in different other Asian countries for the old Soviet ammunition. So that's why that is the balance of this time when Ukraine will have enough and when Russia will not have enough of the ammunition for the real big counteroffensive operation.
A mistake. So in your judgment, we're not going to see a major Russian offensive this year? We're seeing it now in Bakhmut?
At least what we heard from the military that the counteroffensive of the Russian Federation already started in the beginning of February. That is just the characteristic of what is their capabilities for the ground counteroffensive. What they're doing around Bakhmut, what they're doing in the Donetsk region, that's already some type of, at least what they present for themselves as the counteroffensive. The question is that it is not grandiose, it's not that great, and luckily it's not that effective.
Thank you. Doug, do you agree with that?
Yeah, John, let me weigh in on this as well. I do agree. And I think the principal reason for this is that the additional mobilized Russian forces were mobilized and inserted into a broken army. So the Russian formations that started the invasion a year ago, right, suffered heavy attrition and demonstrated a lack of cohesion, a lack of discipline, lousy leadership, poor training, inadequate equipment, and so forth. So pouring additional hardly trained, barely trained soldiers into that structure won't result in a significant advance on military capability. So I agree. I think we're seeing the Russian offensive right now, and we're talking about territorial gains of yards and feet, not 10s and 20 kilometer gains. So I think this is it. And it really reflects that the Russian military has largely culminated in a military sense where it is now in Ukraine.
Thank you. Deborah, last week, the Russians destroyed a U.S. drone in international airspace over the Black Sea. Kremlin officials denied that they tried to bring it down, but then Putin gave medals to the Russian pilots who were involved in the downing of the drone. What is the meaning of that incident, And how has the White House handled this development?
Well, first, I thought what Senator Kelly said about the Russian Air Force was pretty interesting. I don't know if you've all seen that, but he had some extensive quotes on the incompetence of Russian pilots. And I don't know. I'm not a genius on this. I'm not going to say that I know they were really trying to bring it down versus just harass it. I just don't know. But it was almost comical in some ways in the way this was done and handled. I thought the White House had an insufficient amount of outrage on this. I mean, if this was something that North Korea had done, the answer would have been much different. But I thought the most interesting part of this drone, and we've heard this repeated a number of times, is that the US was able to wipe clean this drone of any sort of operational security issues that would have given the Russians any information. And I thought that was very interesting, because one of the reasons the US has given to the Ukrainians for not providing Reapers or Gray Eagles has been that they could not overcome some operational security issues for that. And my view is, if the Russians have their hand on Reaper and it's been wiped clean, why couldn't that same technology be provided to Ukraine? So I'm sorry to turn around your question a little bit, but that one just begged to be answered.
Fair point. Okay, thank you. Steve, China is looming ever larger in the picture. Beijing recently offered a peace plan for the war. The administration has said that China is considering sending arms to Russia. There are now credible stories suggesting that China has in fact sent limited quantities of small arms and components for drones. China denies this, even as Xi sits in Moscow. What is China up to, and what do you expect from Xi's visit to Moscow and his discussed call to Zelinski, if that actually happens?
Yeah. No, John, very good questions. Let me break my answer down into two parts. First, the Chinese peace plan. I mean, right now, what you have is a list of principles. A number of those principles are positive from the point of view of Ukraine: sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity, independence, protection of civilians, no nuclear use, no nuclear threats, keeping nuclear power plants free. But what's missing there are things like Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. So the question I have is, how do the Chinese propose to take this list of ideas and turn them into a concrete plan to end the war? And thus far, we don't have a clue. So a couple things I'm looking for. Perhaps President Xi will enlighten us at the press conference that I guess is supposed to take place within a couple of hours in Moscow. One, does he give a more definitive view of how China would implement these principles? And two, he has real leverage with Putin. Does he use that leverage to push Putin to change course? Absent a more definitive view of what the Chinese plan is, or absent some evidence that Xi is pressing Putin, it's a piece of paper. It allows the Chinese to say that they have a proposal on the table, but it doesn't seem to be a serious bid to end the war. So I tend towards skepticism, but I'm perfectly happy to have President Xi prove me wrong, maybe even an hour or two. Let me talk on the wider question of the Chinese approach and Xi's approach to Russia and Putin. I mean, first of all, Xi wants to be supportive of Putin. I think Russia and China see themselves as partners in trying to undermine American power and influence. But at the same time, Russia's war against Ukraine contradicts key principles of Chinese foreign policy: peaceful resolution of disputes, sovereignty, territorial integrity. And I think in China, they recognize there's a certain amount of image risk in getting too close to Putin. It can't be pleasing to China that 3 days before Xi arrived in Moscow, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Putin. Now, Xi and Putin, a year ago, literally on the eve of the major Russian invasion, declared this partnership without limits. But in the past year, we have seen there are limits. China has not recognized Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. It has not recognized, accepted the supposed annexation of the 4 Ukrainian oblasts last September. China has not joined that handful of countries in the UN General Assembly in supporting Russia. On UNGA votes, it's abstained, and it spoke out publicly against Russian nuclear threats. So I think China's sort of trying to find a balance here. Now, the US government is concerned that China is considering providing major arms to Russia, but I think that's still an open question. And there are a couple of questions China has to ask. Does Beijing really completely want to write off the US-China relationship? I think there were indications before the balloon shoot down that both sides wanted to sort of move in a bit more positive direction. Providing major arms to Russia will kill that prospect. But it's not just with China. It's also going to kill that prospect with Europe. And again, I think China wants to maintain relations with Europe because when China looks at its economics at a time when Chinese economic growth is beginning to slow, China's two big markets are the United States and Europe. So we're waiting to see what Xi says, but I think he faces some tough choices here. And I wouldn't be surprised if he continues to try to find a way to continue to sit on the fence.
Steve, let me do a quick follow-up. Do you think that Putin is reluctant to say yes to the Chinese peace plan?
I think that Putin has a certain dilemma with that peace plan because, again, many of those ideas in there do not work to Russian advantage. So he's generally been positive towards the idea. But again, I think he gets nervous to the extent that the Chinese add some definition to that plan if, and it's still an if, the Chinese are serious about using this to try to forge an end to this war between Russia and Ukraine.
One comment here and one follow-up question. I suspect the Putin visit to Crimea and Mariupol before Xi arrived, in fact, some people say it was a body double, not Putin himself, was designed to show his concerns about the Chinese plan. But of course, Washington is concerned that Putin might accept the plan and argue for a ceasefire in place. Your comments on that?
I don't think that there is any advantage to Ukraine in a ceasefire in place. I mean, in effect, in 2014 and 2015, you saw a ceasefire in place in Donbass, and Ukraine never got any of that territory back. So I think that's a trap that the Ukrainians would be wise to avoid.
Okay, thank you. Doug, Ukraine has been asking for longer range fires and advanced fighters for many months. Poland and Slovakia are now sending MiG-29s to Ukraine. The U.S. is still saying no to F-16s and to long-range fires like ATACMS with a range of 300 kilometers. At the same time, at least on background, the administration is suggesting the time is not on Ukraine's side and it needs to launch a successful counteroffensive this year. Why is the administration hesitant to send these arms, and should it reconsider?
Well, I think the shorthand from the administration's perspective is that they're concerned about the potential of escalation, right? And in their mind, providing Ukraine these longer range systems opens the Ukrainian capacity to strike on Russian territory itself and therefore escalate because you'd have Western or US provided systems actually striking mainland Russia. This comes down, though, to a real dilemma with regard to Crimea. So Russian occupied and now annexed Crimea is the home base for the Black Sea Fleet, Sevastopol, right? And you have the Black Sea Fleet based in Crimea, arming itself, going out into international waters in the Black Sea, firing long-range missiles, cruise missiles and so forth against Ukraine, and then returning and being rearmed, refueled in Crimea, which is sovereign Ukrainian territory. So you can make the case that if we provided such long-range systems, you could work an arrangement, an agreement with the Ukrainians that they would only use these longer-range systems to strike sovereign Ukrainian territory, I would argue, to include Crimea, but not mainland Russia itself. And by the way, the Ukrainians so far have proven very reliable, very disciplined with regard to the restrictions that we placed on them. And I don't know why we're sort of tying their hands with regard to these longer range systems when the Russian strikes from Ukrainian territory are causing civilian casualties and heavy destruction of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine itself. So it does not make sense to me. And I think this is one place where, or one arena in which the administration's policy does not make sense, given the administration's stated objectives.
Thank you. Hannah, if you want to jump in on that point too, please do. And then I have another question for you.
Yes, very briefly. It seems to me that this mantra about not provoking escalation was giving Ukraine long-range missiles or any type of the equipment. It was more or less logical and understandable a year ago, but after a year of use of different types of the equipment, and after the development of Ukrainian military equipment, that sounds quite strange because Russia using all types of the missiles against Ukraine. So the question always that we ask at the meetings at MODs of different NATO member states, what do you mean under the escalation, further escalation? Russians used Kinzhal, Russians used all type of missiles, they're using strategic aviation. The only thing they haven't used is nuclear weapon. Okay, but who should be afraid of this? What type of the escalation do you mean under this? Because if Russia uses nuclear weapons, means that they lost everything with the conventional weapons. And that's the question, will it be beneficial for Russia itself in this case to demonstrate that they lost to the conventional war? And unfortunately, I would say that in none of the MODs that I visited within the last 6 months, I received any clear answer. The answer is always the same. We're afraid of the further escalation. Nobody in none of the countries from both sides of the Atlantic really responded, what does mean this escalation? And then targeting something at the territory of Russia. Just a few days ago, we targeted near Moscow. For this, you have drones. You don't need the long-range missiles only. And Ukraine already has not only the US, but a lot of the other countries and Ukrainian-made drones that can target 300, 500 kilometers ranges. That's why it seems to me it's more psychological and political rather than strategic decision as for now.
Okay, thank you. Now, a follow-up question, which actually is a little bit related to this. What is your expectation regarding the upcoming Ukraine offensive? Does Ukraine have enough hardware for a successful operation? And what would the impact of the longer range fires and tanks and fighters be on the outcome?
We need clearly understand why Ukraine is asking for, especially for the long range missiles, because that allows us to target the Russian ammunition. As for now, we have approximately 1 to 5 for the balance between the available ammunition per day that we can use. So definitely to start any type of the effective counteroffensive, we need to suppress the firepower of the Russian Federation. And in this case, not to lose our equipment, our people, we need these long-range missiles because that can target their stockpile of ammunition at the territory of Crimea, for example, or in Berdyansk and Zaporizhzhia and other parts that are under their control. When we speak about the tanks, that is good for the counteroffensive around Bakhmut or the territories like this, where we have the close battle and where Russians are using a lot of their tanks. So we need to be more or less in the parity of their capabilities on the ground. When you speak about the jets, Ukraine is asking them more for the air defense purposes, not for the counteroffensive purposes. Because as for now, Russians are using a lot of the air to land, air to surface missiles exactly from their jets, especially Su-35. And those types of the aircraft that we have, they cannot come closer to them to be effective in countering them, in intercepting them, because of the different types of the GPS that they are using. So de facto, we are endangering our pilots each time we are coming. And Russia is continuing using a lot of their airplanes, jets, in each of the attack against the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. So that's why those types of the equipment that Ukraine is asking, those types of ammunition that we're asking, they serve different purposes, not only the possible counteroffensive.
Thank you. Deborah, I know you've also been following the weapons battles combination closely. Do you have any comments on this?
Just a couple of quick ones to build on what General Lute said. In fact, the Ukrainians have told the US and the Secretary General of NATO and other countries that they will give an Ironclad ROE, a role of engagement on the use of these weapons. They've said this numerous times at the margins of Ramstein, the Ramstein things. They've told this to them. They will agree on target sets. They will agree on timing of those target sets, and they will agree on BDA, on battle data assessment, and share it with the West. These are, as General Lute knows, the type of guarantees that most of our allies in Afghanistan and Iraq would never give us. And these are very ironclad rules of engagement. And as General Lute has said, Ukraine has been very disciplined on this before. They had their feet held to the fire when they first got HIMARS and how they use them and where they use them and under what circumstances. And they did it very well, and they did it quite successfully, and there were no complaints. And frankly, if there were any complaints, the White House wouldn't have announced more Gimlers going to Ukraine again yesterday. So I think the point is, the White House seems to be buying into the Russian view of red lines and adopting what our Russian red lines as our own red lines. And I don't think that's ever going to end well for Ukraine, and it certainly won't end well for the United States' role as the world's greatest superpower. So I just had to get that off my chest.
Okay. Well, you've actually touched on what I was about to ask, but I think I'll still ask it so you can talk about it in more detail. Ben Hodges has argued that Ukraine could deal a decisive blow to Russia via a counteroffensive in the south to cut the land bridge to Crimea. There have been credible reports that the administration is concerned that an effort to recover Crimea might cross Putin's red line. So your view regarding this red line, is it real, and what the U.S. should do or not do?
So my view is that, Putin's red lines have moved quite substantially over the course of the past year. And it should not be the United States saying that we're adopting your red line, because that just meets the Russian narrative of what that is. Now, let's talk a little bit about the tactical nuclear weapons. I really think that there is strong fear on the part of Russia, and I think they're probably hearing this from Xi Jinping today. I'm sure they've heard it from Iran. I'm sure they've heard it from India as well as Pakistan, countries that depend on the threat of their nuclear deterrence as opposed to ever using it. That what if you actually used a tactical nuclear weapon and the situation didn't change? Armageddon did not ensue. The world did not end. The clock didn't, stop ticking. And so I think this threat of a tactical nuclear weapon has gotten people unnecessarily shaking in their boots. I think most military commanders, this is not a strategic weapon, and I'm looking at my colleague, Ambassador Pfeiffer here. There's a big difference, and it would take the military to have to use this Iskander, roll it out in the middle, and then dirty the battle space. And so why would you use something that then makes your troops put at harm when you can use a conventional weapon and get the same sort of effect without the dirty battle space? And again, what if you exploded a tactical nuclear weapon and no one batted an eyelash? And that then undermines that whole concept of what Iran is hoping for, the whole threat that countries like that put on the world in terms of a nuclear deterrent. So I think buying into a Russian red line is ridiculous. I think it makes us look foolish and not as strong as we should be. And I'll quote a senior Polish official who said, "Why is it that the closer we are to the conflict, the less afraid we are of the tactical nuclear weapon use, but the further people are west of Berlin, the more afraid they are?" And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Steve, I have a separate question for you, but you spent a large part of your career dealing with strategic weapons. Do you have any comments on this as well?
Just that I agree with Deborah. I think, in fact, the Russians tried to lower the nuclear rhetoric in the last part of last year, because in part, audiences that matter to them, the Chinese, the Indians, the global South, I think they would go nuts if the Russians introduced nuclear weapons into this thing. So I think that we can't totally dismiss that risk, but it's very small.
Okay, thank you. We talked before about the Xi peace plan, quote unquote. As you know, many observers, especially those who don't know Russia very well, have been calling for the USG to profess for no negotiations to end the war. What's your view of that?
Yeah, good question. Look, at some point there will be a negotiation on this war, but I disagree strongly that the United States should be pushing for those negotiations now. I mean, it's clear there's zero common ground between Moscow and Kyiv. Now, if you go back to February of last year, the Russian demands there for an end to the fighting were already maximalist. Basically total capitulation by the Ukrainian side. The bizarre thing was in September, while the Russians had been losing for 6 weeks on the battlefield, Putin upped the ante. Putin now says, well, Ukraine has to recognize Russia's so-called annexation of 4 parts of Ukraine, even though, again, the Russians didn't control all of those territories and the Russians were losing on the battlefield. So you've got, I think, at this point, an approach in Moscow that leaves a lot to be desired. The Russians say that they would welcome serious proposals for negotiation, but they're offering nothing themselves. That's not a serious approach. On the Ukrainian side, I believe that actually President Zelinski was truly pained initially that Ukrainians were getting killed every day. I think he was prepared to do some serious steps, accepting neutrality. There were even some hints that he was prepared to consider territorial concessions.
But that changed in March of last year, and it changed when Ukrainian forces liberated towns like Bucha and Irpin. They saw the atrocities, they saw the war crimes, and that hardened the attitude both in the Ukrainian government, but also among the Ukrainian public. It was further hardened when they saw the brutal destruction of Mariupol over 3 months. And you now have Ukrainian public opinion polls showing that 90% plus of the population want to fight to victory. Now, President Zelensky has laid out his requirements for peace, Russian withdrawal, reparations, accountability. I'm not sure he could get all of that in a negotiation, but real negotiations are not going to start until Moscow takes a realistic view and changes its approach. And then it's going to be up, I think, then the Ukrainians, and this has to be a decision not for the US or the West, but then President Zelensky has to decide if he's going to engage in a negotiation that might involve compromises on some of his positions, how can he make that given a very strong attitude on the part of the Ukrainian public? Let me also say this is not going to be a US-Russia negotiation. It'll be, first of all, between Moscow and Kyiv, perhaps with some mediation. The United States might get involved in some ancillary questions. For example, sanctions relief, if that becomes part of the deal, although I hope that the West maintains sanctions on Russia for quite some time to come. But again, no serious negotiation until the Kremlin changes its approach. The best way to bring that about is to be providing the Ukrainians more military capability so that they can achieve success on the battlefield now that either pushes the Russians out or brings Moscow to a point where it's negotiating on a settlement that Kyiv could accept. The way to get to that is that's the way to end the war, is giving the Ukrainians the capability to change the field on the battlefield, not to push the Ukrainians into premature negotiations.
Thank you. Hannah, as the sole Ukrainian on the panel, I think I need to have you weigh in also on the notion of negotiations before I turn to audience questions.
John, my position. I don't understand why negotiations are taken as the ultimate goal. Negotiations is just the instrument. That's understandable that some type of the negotiations will take place. We don't remember any type of the worst of the last centuries that some kind of negotiations haven't happened. We wish to have something like the classical battle with the winners and losers, but that's always difficult. There are still a lot of questions about reparations, exchange of prisoners of war, any other stuff that definitely will be negotiated. The problem is with what we are coming to these negotiations. And as for now, we don't see that the Russian position changed even for 0.1% since March last year. Even more, I would say that in the Russian leadership rhetoric, they became much more ultimatum style, more aggressive, more genocidal, more anti-Ukrainian than what they talked a year ago. And as for now, we also hear that their request started to be not only about Ukraine, but for others. So the question is also to others what they are ready to discuss with the Russian Federation. And here it seems to me that if we just agree to sit and to talk, it will give the floor and the media highlights to the Russian leadership to continue telling the same nonsense as what they're doing in the United Nations Security Council. And we just had this meeting last week about Russophobia. Come on, that is not up to the United Nations Security Council to discuss such issues. But Russia is using any type of the platform where they can legally speak about this. And you can imagine the international negotiations about the end of the war. Definitely, they will use these for the propaganda both inside of the country and outside. That's why we can sit and to negotiate some individual questions like grain deal, like safety of navigation, something else. I mean, that can be denuclearization or safety of the nuclear power plants currently occupied by Russia. But if you say just let's cease fire, let's freeze the conflict right here and negotiate some kind of peace, I just don't see a sense in it because I don't see the prerequisites, the background conditions for two sides to sit and to discuss. As now we are discussing just Ukrainian position to survive and Russian leadership position just to destroy the nation, not even the country and the state, but the nation as it is. And that is not the starting position for any type of negotiations.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'd like to commend all our panelists for being economical in their answers, so we have a bit more time for audience questions. So we have a nuanced question from Jack Kruponsky. I think I'll give this to you, General Lute. Is there any metric of acceptable success for a spring Ukrainian counteroffensive, short of fully evicting Russia from all of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea? Or put another way, what sort of offensive would be successful, even if not completely successful?
Well, you can imagine, just given the battlefield geometry, that a significant operational impact could be achieved if Ukraine were able to move to attack in the south, in the southeast, and break the land bridge, which is currently resupplying Crimea. So this would be perhaps through Zaporizhzhia and down to the sea. This would accomplish two things. It would divide the Russian occupied area, the Russian territory, Russian held territory. It would break the supply lines to Crimea, absent the bridge across the Kerch Strait, which is under repair right now in any event, and would increasingly make Russia's occupation, especially military occupation of Crimea, less tenable. And it would have a dramatic impact, I think, on Russian morale and motivation for those who are supporting Ukraine. So you can imagine that. That's short, obviously, of the premise of your question, which is recapturing all of Ukrainian territory, or even that territory occupied by Russia over the last year. But it is one operational objective that could have a significant impact.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have a question from Mike Whitfield. Can the panel respond very precisely, if possible? What is the Ukrainian situation with logistics and ammunition supply? Are they robust enough to sustain a strong and protracted counteroffensive? Debbie, you want to take a first shot at that?
Sure. I think, first of all, I think there's more motivation. I think there's more motivation and more burden sharing by Western countries than in 40 years of NATO history here. And I think there's a number of countries who have capacity to produce and deliver 155, in particular, artillery for Ukraine that are now doing so and are going down this path. I think some of them had parliaments and the like who were reluctant, and their governments understand what's at stake here, and they're now going down that path. So I think that if you asked me this question 6 months ago, I may have had a different response. But I think both industry in the United States and elsewhere is stepping up to produce the type of artillery Ukraine needs. And I think people are moving away from what I thought was almost a ridiculous statement of blaming the Ukrainians for having too high of a burn rate on artillery before. And I think that's now gone by the wayside, and people understand that they're firing back when they need to fire back. I think logistically, they're in better shape than people thought they were. I think that working with the West and the way weapons are flowing into Ukraine from Poland and other places that are not being talked about publicly is actually far more efficient than people thought it would be. And I think there is to borrow a military term here, there is a battle rhythm here that is working out quite well. Do I want to paint a completely optimistic picture? No, but I want to say that this is not the morass that people thought it would be. And in fact, it's taken a while, but the way equipment is now moving, how it's getting to the front lines, where it needs to go is important. And I'll say one other thing. Any journalist can go out and talk to someone on the front line and get a story that the military is not getting what it needs to get from that commander. But as General Lute knows, the General Zaluzhny has to look at the entire battle space. He can't look at 3 guys on the front line. And he has to make his decisions based on that. And I think in light of those decisions, the right ones are being made and the equipment is getting to who it needs to get to. We still need the West to, not only for Ukraine, but for its own needs, to step up its military production of equipment.
Okay, a good observation, and I'm going to follow up on that by turning to a question from John Weiss, and this is for you, Deborah. Why have NATO and their allies refused to fully support Ukraine's military capabilities by developing deep logistics, such as fully mobilizing their industrial bases? And as you point out, this is important not just for Ukraine's defense, but for America's defense, and for that matter, for our policy in East Asia. So why, I mean, we all know that Secretary Austin, Defense Secretary Austin, summoned our defense industry leaders to the Pentagon almost a year ago, and yet we have not seen a ramp up of industrial production. What's up?
Well, I think there's 2 things. I think there has been a ramp up of industrialized production in certain countries in Europe, Sweden, France. I think there's a problem in Germany where money has been promised, but it hasn't been delivered to places like Rheinmetall at this point. I do think Finland, the Czechs, Slovaks, and others who do have that industrial capacity are ramping up. It took a while and it costs money. And I think the EU, to its credit, by starting its training missions and looking at this, understands that this is important. This is not just a NATO issue, it's an EU issue, because it's the EU who delivers that money and that assessment. Now, for the United States, a little more complicated, obviously. The last National Defense Authorization Act for the first time included multi-year funding for certain weapon systems for the services. That was a big step, because you don't want to invest in a production line and then find out that you don't want what they're producing after that. But I do think people have stepped up. HIMARS are being produced for the first time since 2005. There are other weapon systems that are being produced for the first time since 2000 or 2003. It has taken a very long time to sync the contracting process in the United States with what is needed on a very quick timeline. I'll just give you the example of the Vampire, the counter-drone system, where it was announced by the administration in June, and the Army did not sign a contract with Harris until January, over 6 months later. That made no sense to me, because it was a non-competitive contract. And those sorts of things still have to change, and they have not changed.
Thank you. Doug, do you want to jump in on this? I don't want to push you, but if you have something to say.
Well, I think Deborah hit the nail on the head when she pointed to this multi-year authorization now, so multi-year contracts. So these are business decisions. You can't expect private industry to crank up the labor force, the capital investments in new factories, new wings of factories, and stockpile inputs to munitions and so forth, without some assurance that the government's actually going to buy these things. So they're not going to do this without some reassurance, and that reassurance comes by way of multi-year contracting. So I agree that there's some light on the horizon here by way of that contractual arrangement. I also agree that, look, this has become a bit of a bureaucracy here, with every 2-week announcements of sort of the next increment of support for Ukraine. It's almost as though we're on just a 2-week schedule here to provide the next sort of incremental package, and that's not a way to fight the war. And the Ukrainians are paying the price for this incrementalism. And I think maybe it's an attempt to sort of carefully meter the support to avoid red lines or imaginary red lines. But again, the Ukrainians are paying the price. And I think at the 1-year mark, it's simply not acceptable.
Thank you. Okay. Steve, we've got an interesting question from Rick Green. Demographers have assessed Russia will be facing a national security crisis as early as 2035 because of its negative growth rate, the impact on the cohort of conscript-age males. You might also add the loss of intellectual talent as a result of Putin's repressive and imperial policies. How have massive losses in that cohort in the last 12 months amplified that assessment?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at population projections, they already showed that Russian population was in a decline. I think headed from a current number of about 143 million down to somewhere between 130 and 135 million around 2050. Losing 60,000 men killed in action is only going to accelerate that decline. And I guess I would just make broadly the statement. Russia was in a state of decline by population, economically, before the major invasion that they launched in February. What they've done has accelerated that decline. And I could say almost without, however this war ends specifically, you're going to see Russia weakened militarily, the loss of 60,000 troops already, the loss of huge amounts of equipment that will take them many years to replace, the loss of military reputation. Economically, I mean, the Russian economy is now on a course for at best stagnation, and geopolitical losses. You now have a situation where Finland and I believe Sweden will both be members of NATO. These are all, disasters for Russia caused by Putin's blunder in launching this invasion in February. They will leave Russia a substantially weakened state in the end. Okay, thank you. I'm going to cheat a little bit here and ask a question I should have asked myself before I turn to the audience. This question is for you, Hannah. A truly remarkable thing happened last week, just before the announcement of Xi's visit to Moscow, which was the ICC indictment of the president of a nuclear superpower. What impact do you think this has on Russia's conduct of the war? And you might say the global posturing, political posturing of Russia in the war.
First of all, we definitely noticed that in Russian media, in Russian statement, they tried to downplay these news to make them not important, or because Russia didn't ratify ICC charter, wherever, so who cares? But at the same time, we felt that it really mattered for them, because even at the United Nations Security Council, the Russian representative started to justify the Russian actions, saying that they are not kidnapping Ukrainian kids, but just protecting them. So it really touched their feelings. But why it was really important, it seems to me, for all those countries that have been trying to, Ukrainian expression, to go in between the drops of the rain. And let's be honest, a lot of countries in the global south try to do it in relations with Russia. The decision of the order of the International Criminal Court made them to not probably to take the sides, but at least to make a strong statement, like South Africa, for example, that most of the resolutions in the UN voted abstain. But this time they said, yes, they understand their impact and the seriousness of this, but what to do? The international law is international law. We already heard from some Asian countries the very strong statement, even from Germany, that they're ready to arrest Mr. Putin. So it seems to me that made for Vladimir Putin the room for maneuver much smaller. And let's hope that it will limit his attempts to establish relations with some countries in Africa and Asia.
Okay, I see that.
John, could I just add that
Jump in.
123 countries have signed the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court.
And my guess is that means there's 123 countries that when people in Moscow are looking at Vladimir Putin's travel plans, there's a big question mark over those countries.
Yeah, I see that Patrick Dalsell put in a question about the ICC, and you've covered most of it, Hannah, but he asked, might this also affect the position of Russian oligarchs in connection with the war?
You know, there were already so many cases when we hoped that Russian oligarchs would become more proactive. However, the general conclusion is that they became more proactive only in the attempt to whitewash themselves and to distance, like the latest open letter of the so-called Russian opposition trying to get rid of the sanctions for 3 Russian oligarchs. That sounded really odd, but that is a reality. That's how they try to operate. It seems to me they still are too much afraid of the Russian apparatus, the security apparatus, and the Mr. Putin KGB past. That's why they're not trying to oppose or counter him directly. They're more trying to secure themselves.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Ariel Cohn. Is there concern about the political resolve of the West to support Ukraine, especially in view of the U.S. political calendar and the articulated positions of Trump and now DeSantis? Others have also asked about the Republicans and the war. So, Steve, what do you think?
All right. Well, I think if you look back over the 30 years since Ukraine regained its independence, you have generally seen strong bipartisan support for Ukraine, both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. But I have to say that for the first time in those 30 years, I've become a little bit nervous in the last 8 months. And what you have now is, I think, a relatively small part of the Republican Party fails to understand the strategic importance for the United States of this conflict. They don't understand that there is a vital U.S. national interest there. You see this reflected in comments, for example, by the Speaker of the House. And I worry that if that grows, it could weaken U.S. support here. What I would like to see, and I think there's a burden both on the administration to speak out more clearly about what the United States has at stake in this war between Russia and Ukraine. But I would also like to see more traditional Republican leaders speak out to maintain their support for U.S. assistance to Ukraine in the conflict.
Okay, thank you.
And John,
please, Doug.
Yeah, if I may, this is one of the dimensions of Putin's playing the long game, right? I mean, he's reading these reports as well, right? And he's sort of betting on the chance that America will become so divided that the support for Ukraine will be fractured and will atrophy over time. And that, therefore, is another argument to get past this sort of incremental drip by drip approach to support to Ukraine and give them, as on an emergency basis and on a priority basis, what they need as soon as possible, so that we avoid some of the political calendar that's coming up next year. Now is the time to give Ukraine what they need.
Okay, I think many of us agree with that. Okay, let's see. Looking through, oh, here it is. A question from Stephen Fisher. Russians committed documented war crimes in Ukraine and have destroyed at least 1/3 of Ukraine's economy. Putin has been indicted by the ICC, as we know, for the abduction of Ukrainian children. How much flexibility does Zelinski have, taking into account Ukrainian public opinion in negotiating peace? Hannah?
That is just the first case, because that was probably the easiest to issue the order and to prove, because Putin openly on TV acknowledged this crime, as well as Mrs. Belova. That's why it is not stopping all other criminal cases and international humanitarian law cases, neither against Russia nor against Mr. Putin personally. We know that a big tribunal is in the process of preparation. Around 40 countries supported this idea. We have 3 cases, Ukraine against Russia in the International Court of Justice. We have a big case, Ukraine against Russia, in the European Court of Human Rights. So this legal battlefield will continue. And it is just not that public, probably not so sexy yet for the media, but it doesn't mean that we are stopping. And definitely when Ukraine is speaking about the peace, and if you read the Mr. Zelensky peace plan, it always includes these elements of justice. Without justice, people on the ground will not accept any type of the peace agreements. You can discuss about reparations, who will pay for them and how it will happen. But without the justice, not only in terms of Mr. Putin crimes, but in terms of each Russian soldier that committed a war crime at the territory of Ukraine, human rights organizations, just civilians, they will continue the struggle as long as it is necessary.
Okay, thank you. And also a nice short answer. We have a tough question from Jeffrey Mistein. Given the rates and magnitudes of both Ukrainian and Russian soldiers being killed and wounded, how can the Ukrainians keep fielding trained troops in the front? Deborah, you want to take a first crack at that? And then if Hannah wants to jump, actually, anyone can jump in, but give Deborah, you have a first shot. Yeah, please unmute. If you can. If you can't, we'll jump to someone else. This is odd. Okay, Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, so let me just kick this off. I mean, look, this is an argument about quantity of military manpower, right? And here the argument usually centers on, look, the Russian population is 3 times the size of the Ukrainian population, so doesn't Russia have a sort of a unfair advantage? And in the long run, won't the weight of that Russian manpower sort of play out on the battlefield? I look at this quite differently from a military perspective, and I look at it from a qualitative perspective. And what we know is that in the history of warfare, often it's the force of higher quality, better soldiers that beats the larger quantity of opposing forces. And here, the Ukrainians have proven that their leadership, their discipline, their unit cohesion are all much better than the Russian opponents. So I give the vote here to quality over quantity, and therefore I think the argument's actually kind of turned on its head, because I think the more appropriate question might be, or the more probing question might be, how can the Russians stand up to the overwhelming qualitative advantage of the Ukrainian forces?
Thank you. Deborah, you have the last word. We have 1 minute.
I apologize. 2 things. One is I agree with everything General Lute just said, which also argues for giving them what they need now to end this war now with success. And the second point, to those who are pushing negotiated settlements, just want to point out a historical fact here. Before the U.S. even ventures down this path, please keep in mind that there has never been a successful in the last 70 years of any peace settlement working, no DMZs, nothing like that, unless the U.S. puts boots on the ground, even if it's just the U.S. Berlin Brigade in the 60s in Berlin. And so before people go down the path of looking at peace negotiations, they need to talk about who's going to enforce that peace. Is it going to be Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, and South African peacekeepers, which the Russians won't care about? But is the U.S. willing to put boots on the ground to enforce some sort of peace negotiation? Because it's the only way it has worked in the last 70 years. And if you want it to fail, don't have U.S. boots on the ground.
Provocative final comment. Thank you all for your crisp remarks, and thank you all for tuning in.